Welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure for me to be hosting this event today, focused on Jonathan Slater's new report on fixing Whitehall's broken policy machine. It's been great to work with Jonathan on the report and see how it's ended up with his very important and practical recommendations, which have been picked up and discussed quite widely already in the media. Jonathan is a visiting professor at the Policy Institute at King's, and of course, former permanent secretary at the Department of Education. But before that, he had very many roles in government, in the Cabinet Office, number 10, MOJ, MOD, but also crucially worked in local government prior to joining central government, which has informed his thinking in the report, as I'm sure we'll hear. So in the session today, Jonathan will outline the main points from his report to kick us off, and then we have really an incredible panel to discuss some of the themes. I'll introduce them now, and just briefly, as we've only got an hour for this really rich, what I think will be a really rich discussion. So after Jonathan, we'll hear first from Lord Gus O'Donnell, who was, of course, Cabinet Secretary for a number of years, and before that, Permanent Secretary at the Treasury. And among his many current roles, he's the non-executive chairman of Frontier Economics in Europe. Then we'll hear thoughts from Justine Greening, who also had a number of government roles as Secretary of State for Education, International Development and Transport, as well as Minister for Women and Equalities. Justine is also the founder of the Social Mobility Pledge. After we've heard from Jonathan and the panel, we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion with you. We do have the Q&A function on the webinar today, so do put them in there. Try to get them in early. We've had over 1,000 sign-ups for this event, so the earlier you get your questions in, the more likely I'll be able to get to them. So given time, I'm going to just hand straight over to Jonathan to get us started. Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Bobby, to you and for King's for all your help in getting to where we got to today. And thanks everybody for joining the session, particularly those civil servants and public servants who are with us today. I know how busy and how hard you will all be working in light of the catastrophe in the Ukraine. I've seen plenty of occasions in my past where civil servants and other public servants have, worked all the hours there are to try and stand up new services in a crisis like this. And so, thank you for the work that you do. Particularly, thank you for coming along today in circumstances where this is not your only opportunity to hear something about civil service reform, is it? Barely a week goes by without some new report on the subject, whether it's the Institute for Government or Policy Exchange, there's Michael Gove's Declaration of Government Reform, Nick Herbert's Smarter Government Initiative, Kate Bingham. There's no shortages of views on civil service reform, and it's possible you might be wondering if I've got anything different to say, and hoping that I have. After all, most of these reports, albeit coming from different angles, do come up with some fairly common conclusions. They pretty much always say, what is the problem with Whitehall? Too much churn. People move too quickly from job to job, don't get held accountable for achieving real world outcomes, don't stay in the role long enough to actually learn the subject matter. So if that's what they all say, you're going to get anything different today. So I've got good news and bad news. Let's get the bad news out of the way first. When you read my paper, as I hope you will later on today, you will indeed discover that I think that churn, civil servants moving too quickly, and generalism, civil servants who don't really know their subject matter, are at the heart of the problems in Whitehall. So the bad news is that I agree with other reports, but I hope that you won't switch off at this point, because I think I have got something to say that I don't read a lot of. Why is it that despite the fact everybody wants to tackle churn and the power of the generalist over the specialist, those things never seem to change? Why is it that if you read Fulton's report for Harold Wilson, back in 1968, his analysis is that what stands in the way of Whitehall performing is churn and generalism? To get to that, you've got to get to the root cause. That's what I've been focusing on in the last year with help from King's, conversations with many civil servants, past and present, ministers, past and present, colleagues from elsewhere in the world, Germany, Singapore, elsewhere. If you get to the root cause, then you've got a chance of tackling it. And that's what I've been trying to do. So let's see if I've got anything interesting to say on these. First of all, let's start with the reasons that people give you as to why churn and generalism prevail that are wrong. People will tell you that the reason why civil servants move from job to job is it's the only way to get a pay rise. And indeed, it is the case that in the last 10 years, the best way to get a pay rise is a promotion. And so obviously that does encourage churn, but the pay system of the civil service has not been that way for the last 60 years. It was not that way under Fulton. You used to get a pay rise for staying in role and your increments. So although the pay system, pay constraint of the last 10 years has made things worse, it's not the reason. The other reason you get to hear from people as to why people move fast around the jobs, around from job to job, is because that's what ministers want. That's what people will tell you, that what ministers prioritize is the civil servant who can help them navigate their way around the machine, who can handle a difficult negotiation with the Treasury, who can sound convincing, who can dig them out of a hole in advance of a parliamentary select committee. And that push comes to shove, ministers want those people rather than people who actually know what they're talking about, whether that's in education or health or anything else. But actually, whilst of course it is true that ministers want people who understand how the machine works, of course they do, what frustrates ministers is that they get served up by people who only know how the machine works. And the ministers I've worked for, not all of them, but nearly all of them, want people who can do two things, right? They think, shouldn't senior civil servants be able to walk and chew gum? Shouldn't they be able to understand how the machine works and understand what's going on at the front line? Is that too hard? I've worked for plenty of ministers who are very frustrated that the civil servants who advise them day in, day out don't know their subject matter. So it's not pay and it's not ministers. So what is going on here? Well, I think, and I'm afraid to say, that it's us, by which I mean senior civil servants, past and present. We're the ones, and I'm going to include myself in this, who, when push comes to shove, prioritize handling skills, Whitehall warrior skills, over really understanding things from the point of view of the public. I've lost count of the number of times when, as the permanent secretary of the Department for Education and as a Director General in other departments, I would receive a call from a colleague in another department inviting me to have a chat with so-and-so, very promising young person, destined for the top. And when I would meet this person, what would I find? I'd find they sounded convincing, they sounded clever, they'd been to the right sort of university, they understood how Whitehall worked, and they knew nothing about education or defence or whatever the subject was. I mean, they'd been at school, right? But they knew nothing about the subject matter. And it was the senior civil servant who was sending this person to me. It wasn't the minister, it's us as civil servants, senior civil servants, who prioritize handling over understanding. Why do we do that? Well, I think there are two reasons we do it. The first is what got us to the top. How did we get to the top of the civil service? Answer, because of our handling skills. That's the system that we joined. It's not what we wanted when we arrived in the civil service. You ask anybody why they join, and they say they want to make a difference. And you ask senior civil servants what they're proudest of at the end of their careers, they say the times they made the difference, of course. But actually, they're operating in a system which rewards them for their handling skills. And if you get to the top accordingly, you're going to be quite brave, aren't you, to say, this is no good, this system is failing. This system that got me to the top because of my handling skills is not good. And we need people who are different from me. You can see why senior civil servants don't talk that language, right? But it's true. The second reason why we operate that way is because, well, just imagine the alternative. Imagine you'll get rewarded and promoted not for your ability to handle difficult conversations with the Treasury, but for actually achieving real world outcomes in schools. Goodness me, that's hard, isn't it? Right? To achieve an improvement of the life chance of children, say, requires a collaboration between ministers, civil servants in your department, in other departments, the Treasury, number 10, teachers, pupils, parents. I mean, this is really hard stuff. If your pay rise and your promotion and your prospects are determined by what you actually achieve on the ground, as opposed to how good you sound in Whitehall, well, you can see why people shy away from that. But unfortunately, we've got to own that problem. We've got to shy away from it because it really matters these days. Government is too important for us to allow the status quo to continue. Back in the 60s, when I was a child, Frankly, it didn't matter that much whether civil service and the Department for Education really knew their stuff, because councils ran schools, but they don't anymore. The Department for Education runs schools. And so the quality of our advice and what we really know really matters. So if we're going to tackle these issues, we need to do two things. The first is we've got to own the problem. Uncomfortable that must be for all of us, we as past and present senior civil servants need to recognize that it's our responsibility that the system prioritizes generalists over experts, prioritizes churn over staying in post long enough to achieve a difference. We've got to own that problem and we've got to put it right, which we can. The civil service can make and has made really big improvements in areas where it's chosen to. When I arrived 20 years ago, the people running the finance function of government departments weren't even accountants. The people running the HR functions of government departments were, and I quote, people who were told they weren't good enough to do anything else. Right, that situation has been transformed in the last 20 years. The HR, finance, digital functions, they're miles better than they were 20 years ago. That's because the civil service leadership decided to do something about it. Frontline delivery in prisons, in job centres, in tax offices, so much better than it was a generation ago, because the civil service decided, of course, under ministerial ownership, you could only do this stuff if ministers want to, of course, but the civil servants decided to tackle it. If you look back on it over the last generation or two, in fact, the only bit of the civil service that has not been transformed over the last generation or two is the policy function. The red boxes, the submissions, the PQs, the lines to take, the murder boards. I'll let you know afterwards what that means if you don't know. All those sorts of processes that have been operating for the last 50 years are still alive and well. But the civil service can change. It has changed in other areas. So the first solution to churn to generalists is for the senior civil service to own the problem and tackle it together. I've spoken to many senior civil servants, past and present, who want to do so. And change can happen. Final thought, any change that is dependent simply upon one group of leaders is always vulnerable to snapping back to the status quo when those leaders move on. Of course it is. So you need something else. You need leadership which owns the problem, but you need a change in the system as well, so that it doesn't snap back. And that change is a simple one. It's opening up the world of policy making to the public. When I was at education, advising ministers on what to do about the fact schools were going to have to close, we did it in secret. If you want to know what my advice was, you've got to wait 20 years. The people in the room were ministers, special advisors, and civil servants. Where were the teachers? Where were the parents? Where are the pupils? Why was that not done in public? I thought when I joined the civil service, it's just the way the system is. I'd come from local government, where as a director of education, I had to advise politicians which school to close because the birth rate had fallen. And I offered them that advice in public with politicians from all the different parties in the room. I went along to the school to explain to the pupils, the parents, the teachers, why I was recommending closing their school. Why wouldn't I? Why shouldn't I explain to the people affected why I'm recommending something that's going to have an impact on them? They're paying my wages. Why not? You come into Whitehall, it's done in secret. It's ridiculous. This is not how a number of other parliamentary democracies work, as you'll see when you read my report, if you don't know already. If our analysis of the options we were doing were shared in advance with, say, a parliamentary select committee, like in local government, on behalf of the public, the quality of the recommendations and advice would be so much better, rather than just a closed conversation inside Whitehall. An open conversation with the public on the front line would improve the quality of that advice so much, would change our mindset. Instead of just looking upwards to what colleagues in Whitehall think, we'd be looking outwards to what the public wants. Those two changes, leadership and openness, could make such a difference. I know there are many, many people inside and outside the civil service, inside and outside government, who want to make that change. I've been really encouraged by that, and I hope that others will agree with me, because then the public will get a better service. Civil servants' jobs will be so much more rewarding, and you'll never need to read anything ever again about churn or generalists. Back to you, Bobby.
Thank you, Jonathan. What a great, succinct overview of the report. Thank you so much for that. We're getting lots of great questions in. They're coming through thick and fast now, so do keep them coming, and I'll try to organise those. But while next we hear from Gus. Gus, over to you.
Thanks very much. And as you would expect of someone who's been at the Treasury and the civil service, I'm really interested in evidence for all of this, and as opposed to just views. So first of all, I think we need to get this in context. When you look at the evidence for how good is the UK civil service, to be honest, it's really hard to say because very few people have actually done the international research. Those that have put the UK near the top. If you look at the Insights, which was probably the most significant one, which looked at OECD work and the work from the Bertelsmann think tank, on policymaking, the UK is third best in the world. Now, at the same time, I agree with Jonathan that we can and must do a lot better. So how can you reconcile those two things? I think that's, and if I may, I think Jonathan missed out some of the specialists. Actually, I came in as a specialist to the Treasury, as a specialist econometrician to do modelling, and I very much believe in the power of economics in the Treasury. I think that was rather important to have people, economists, writing advice to the Chancellor on interest rates rather than people who've done medieval history. Seemed to me a step forward. So it's that policy thing that is important, and that economics of understanding, well, why is it that we can say we've got one of the best civil services in the world, and yet the civil service isn't doing as well as it should? And the reality is public services around the world face some of the same problems, which is why anecdotally you'll say, oh, these bureaucrats, they're all bloody useless. They can't run anything. For a start, number one, nearly always the civil service and public services in general are running monopolies. They're also running monopsonies. You know, who else buys large amounts of vaccines? Who else buys nuclear submarines? And Economics 101 will tell you that if you want to get high levels of efficiency, you need highly competitive markets. You also need prices. The thing about prices is they give you feedback about what customers want. So when I worked with Dave Lewis, a great CEO of Tesco at Frontier Economics, and we did enormous amounts of really interesting work about things. The feedback they get from their customers every single day is fantastic. And it's very hard to do that in government. So there are some reasons why governments and the things they run will tend to be inefficient relative to the private sector. And that problem is going to get worse because governments are getting bigger around the world. We've just seen Germany saying it's going to spend a lot more of its money on defense, where it will be probably a monopsony provider, and it's certainly a monopolist in running the German defense of the country. So it's not perfect, the civil service. We can and must do better. Yes, I agree with Jonathan that the civil service needs to reform itself. When I was there, I started capability reviews, introduced the top 200, and tried to work on culture change, which Jonathan mentions in the paper. And I think that's really important. I introduced my 4 Ps about pride and passion, which I strongly believe in, and pace and professionalism. All of those, I think, hugely important. But Jonathan, and the one other thing I'll say, but I won't say anything much about, but with Justine, I think it's really important. You can't reform government by just looking at the civil service. You have to think about ministers as well, and the relationship between civil servants and ministers. I'm not going to say any more about that today, but it's like, you know, if you're looking at Tesco's, Dave Lewis ran Tesco's. He spent his life in retail industries, understanding his customers. And yet we ask a minister one day to be a complete expert on defense, and the next day to be a complete expert on work and pensions. You know, in a democratic system, that's not going to happen. If I asked Dave Lewis what he would feel about Tesco's, him being the number 2, as it were, and having as his boss someone who'd actually never worked in a retail industry and someone who might move on in 3 months, I can imagine what he'd say, but it wouldn't be polite, right? So let's get back to Jonathan's main point about, and I think the charge he makes to the civil service is we're not close enough to customers. And to be honest, that's absolutely true. And as Jonathan will know, you are closer to your customers when you're in the local authority. And I think that's right. And the further away you are from customers, so trying to do national policies as opposed to either doing it at local authority or devolved level is much harder. And it's obviously not going to work because the same size doesn't fit everybody. So there is that part. we are definitely not customer focused enough. I remember working with John Major on Citizens Charter, much derided at the time, but he got the point that actually a lot of politicians and a lot of civil servants have never been dependent on public services. They haven't been to the job centre, so why would they know much about it? So I do strongly believe that people should not have the kind of career I had. They should spend some time in an operational job, definitely, and that's, I think, really good for them. I think that understanding consumers, and that's why I am now chair of Pro Bono Economics, where we try and get economists in government to go out and look at the charitable sector, homelessness, those sorts of things, to understand what it's like at the front line, to understand what it's like to be dependent on benefits. I think those things are hugely important. So yes, we need to be more customer focused. Yes, we need to get more operational experience early on. Culture change, certainly, and pay, as mentioned. Pay is a crucial part of this. The pay system in the civil service, I'm now going to use a technical term, completely bonkers, right? It's always been bonkers. Most of the pay comes in form of pension when you've left. What great incentive structure that is, right? It's mad, okay? It's completely mad. We don't pay enough. And surprise, surprise, those skills that are most marketable outside are not the skills of dealing with ministers. They're dealing with operational issues because that's what businesses do. So the operational people who are really good get hired away. And if we want to hire the best in, we have to pay very high salaries. And then you get some ministers that I should try and be polite about, saying you mustn't pay anyone more than the Prime Minister, which is just crazy. So I do think we need to think about the pay system. And I think the other point that Jonathan makes about transparency, and I think it's a kind of common thing that when you leave the civil service, you start to believe in transparency. But actually, I think he's right. And I do think that if we had option appraisals, as he suggests in the paper, that were published, this would be good. And I think it would be good in the sense of it would make us accountable for the evidence we present to ministers. And we should be held to account for that. There's nothing worse, in my mind, than seeing a minister actually being given just wrong facts or wrong information, and as a result coming to the wrong decision, and therefore that minister being criticised when it's actually absolutely not their fault, it's our fault, it's civil services fault. So we need to be held accountable for those option appraisals, and the way you do that is make them transparent, and then the select committees and the rest and the NAO can look at them. But the one thing I would say is that the NAO needs to be less of a kind of how shall I put it, a firing squad post-event to something that actually thinks about preventing disaster, not wallowing in it ex post, right? They need to be there to say, actually, let's look at the case for this. Let's look at the cost-benefit case. And, does it really make sense to do this? And I think that way we prevent disasters. So prevention is so much better than cure. So to be honest, I'm with Jonathan on a lot of this, that actually we need to be much more customer focused. We need some radical change to do this. We could change the career structures. We could change the pay structures. I think those things would be good. I think churn, yes. I think specialism in the job is really important. I can't imagine being in the Treasury, advising on fiscal policy and the like without having any understanding of economics. That just seems to me just bonkers, to use my technical term. So I do think we need more specialism. We need people in education that know about education, and we need to make sure they're around the table. When I look at the COVID stuff, my final point, we had all those people in SAGE, those guys making these decisions about, well, should we close the schools or not? Well, so what's it going to do to transmission? What's it going to do to deaths? Great, okay, so they come up with their numbers, probably quite wide ranges, I imagine. And then who's there saying, well, what's the impact on the kids, on the parents, on their mental health? Let's value that, because these are trade-offs, right? That's the essence of understanding these things, is understanding the trade-offs. So what's the value of life at which these things make sense to do this rather than to do option A rather than option B? All of those things, people hate it, but they should be made much more explicit, and we should be doing those cost benefits. And as far as I can see, quite often we kind of look at some things which we think we value precisely, and lots of other things which are more difficult to analyse, and don't do them so well. But fortunately, we've got the Green Book Supplementary Guidance on Wellbeing, which can help you do all of those things, civil servants listening to this, and so you can now do it. With that, I shall pass on to the Minister, because the Minister needs to have the last word, I think.
Thanks so much, Gus. That was great. So, Jonathan, it'd be great. I'll come back to you for any reflections on Gus's comments, but let's definitely do hear from Justine first. Justine, please.
Thank you. And I mean, really fascinating to hear the points that have been made. Great to see Jonathan and Gus again, actually, on this panel. I suppose, I mean, there's so many points to make here. From my perspective as a Secretary of State, I ran three very different departments. You know, transport was a hugely operational department, obviously plus policy. Duffy was an international department. You know, it would have had a wonderful focus it could have brought to responding to the crisis in Ukraine today on behalf of the UK government. And then, of course, the DFE, you know, my real passion of social mobility and having the chance to lead that department was incredible. But the way I always felt about it, and it's interesting, I guess for me, I was one of those Secretaries of State that had worked in some very large organisations before I went into politics, which I think is probably quite unusual. So I always had quite a clear sense of what I wanted to see from the departments that I was running and how I wanted to approach running them. And not to get overly techie, but I always thought of it in terms of people, processes, systems, and then culture, effectively. And I think to get to the key of how the civil service needs to change to be at its best, you need to look through those different prisms to get a sense of what needs to be fixed. And I should start by saying, I think that has to be complemented, and this is where politicians come in, with a really clear sense of purpose given to departments. And I think one of the times that I have seen the civil service at its very best, and it's been a privilege to be leading those teams and part of them, was when they had purpose. And so at the DFT, it was incredible to see the team rise to the challenge of delivering a London 2012 Olympics in a capital city that was so congested it had to introduce a charge. I can't remember who the mayor was that we worked with then. At Duffy, we did incredible work responding to Ebola with brilliant Chris Whitty, and of course the Syria crisis. And the staff there were hugely committed. And in Duffy, you know, as Jonathan will know, out of the sight of the media largely, there was a team that got on with rebuilding the Kensington Aldridge Academy over a summer that, because of Grenfell, had to effectively vacate the building. There was an incredible team at the DFE that did that, so that those young people had their school back operating at the start of term that following year, just 2-3 months later. That, for me, is when you see the civil servant at its very best. And it was an absolute privilege to be part of those teams. And so I think it's about having the nuts and bolts in place for the people who are employing, for the processes they've got, and I'll come back onto processes in a second, for the management information. And again, you look at levelling up and the lack of management information in the sense the civil service has to really deliver that. But then the right culture and the right sense of purpose has to be part of this. And I think my observation would also be that over recent years, perhaps civil servants have been increasingly almost dragged into some of those political debates that are always going to happen across Whitehall, and in a sense have found it harder to play the role that I always felt the civil service needs to play, which is to be that quite independent voice to ministers of an evidence-based approach on policy that is informed. And I think it's making sure we're able to do that becomes really crucial. Leadership really matters. Can't emphasize that enough. I think that the more your secretary, your permanent secretary is part of that game playing, you know, the worse I think that becomes. I mean, the other points that I really wanted to make were, first of all, levelling up is a real challenge for Whitehall, and it quite possibly will be what really drives Whitehall to change. Levelling Up is a tailored, locally driven, place-based approach on policy and politics. And it really means that Whitehall, in this one-size-fits-all, more traditional approach, where a minister comes in and says, right, I'm going to do this policy, academize schools, and it's going to instantly, be the thing that fixes everything. I think those days are over. And we're going to see a shift away from that quite totemic, arguably simplistic articulation of policy and change that drives on the ground to a much more nuanced one. And I remember conversations that Jonathan and I had when we introduced opportunity areas, which were effectively the DfE doing place-based holistic policy and delivery on the ground. My DfE officials were embedded in local teams, working alongside those local groups that were improving schools. So it was one team, one set of priorities, and one set of measures. But that kind of approach, we were very clear, would have been quite a significant shift for the DfE, because it would have been much more devolved work by officials. It would have required different skill sets from civil servants, much around project management, around relationship management. And it would have seen a devolution of not just policy, but innovation to a much local level. So the team you would have ended up with at the DfE would have been a much smaller team that really was deploying an expertise on hoovering up that innovation that was happening in those different opportunity areas, and then working out how it could systematically spread it so that it created a race to the top informed by the practical work that was going on the ground. That's a very different way of Whitehall achieving change on the ground to, I think, a more traditional approach that's been taken where it's been driven from the top. So there's definitely a big piece of it that I think needs to happen around that. The final point I really wanted to make, there's a lot of points I can make, but the final point I want to make is diversity. And the civil service will be more in touch with a broader public when it represents that broader public. And I really welcome the fact that I think it was a couple of years ago in 2019, there was the socioeconomic diversity tracking done of the civil service. And I think it really gave us a sense of how diverse different departments were, but also it could start, if it was done more annually, which I think it should be, it could start to give us a chance of not only whether you can get into the civil service from diverse backgrounds, but also where you can get on in the civil service. And I think it would really start to give us the data to understand where we need to make interventions to allow people to flow through and crucially up the system. And so I really welcome seeing the civil service push roles out into the regions. I think it's absolutely necessary, but as a former Secretary of State and, dare I say, a former London MP, I'm bound to say that most of you are still based in London, which is a hugely diverse city in this country, and the civil servant doesn't reflect that diversity. So I think there's two parts to the civil service reform change. One is, yes, pushing out those opportunities into communities and parts of the country that haven't really been at all connected to them before. But I think the second piece is actually making sure that back at base, if I can call it that, there's a change process too, and that there's a real distinct, concerted, long-term push to make sure that Whitehall, right here in London, where I'm sat, really does represent that wider London community that is right in the middle of.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justine. And that diversity point clearly coming through in the questions as well from people about how important that is. Alice Taylor asking how important is recruiting a diverse range of people to the civil service to achieving this sort of change. And I wonder, Jonathan, could you just maybe reflect back on all the comments from Gus and Justine, and that from Alice as well, that question from Alice.
So thank you very much, Bobby, and thanks to Gus and Justine for all sorts of challenging, but also I think supportive contributions. So, diversity is absolutely at the heart of this, of course, as Alice and Justine say. if my argument is that Whitehall doesn't understand the public and isn't going to understand the public properly if it is so different from them. And what's depressing about the Social Mobility Commission's report of only a couple of years ago is that they compare the socio-economic background of civil servants in Whitehall today with 40 years ago, and they found it's unchanged over 40 years. And there've been no shortage of speeches about the importance of tackling that, but it hasn't generally made a difference. To take a sort of practical example, I promoted the first non-white senior civil servant to the board of the Department of Education when I was there. It was very white, the senior civil servant at the Department of Education, which there was no justification for, as Justine says, particularly in a place like London. And I changed that, and I remember I've referred to this in the publication. That senior civil servant standing up at a conference and saying that he was, delighted to have had the chance to join the board, but he didn't think he would have if he hadn't been to the right sort of university. The socio-economic status really matters here, and to tackle that, we need to address, as I say, what people get rewarded for. If they get rewarded for what they achieve as opposed to how they sound, then you'll get a different sort of civil servant getting promoted. And that was the sort of change I was trying to push in the department while I was there. And I think we made some progress, recruited lots of different people into the department, recruited plenty of teachers and social workers into the department for a start. I would attend myself every induction meeting of all new starters to the department, and I would invite them to think, what happened if the DfE didn't exist tomorrow? If it simply didn't exist, £500 million of public money would be saved, and teaching social work would still go on. And the question we need to ask ourselves, well, what difference were we making to help teachers and social workers do a better job for the kids? So that was what I was trying to promote in the department. And I think we made a bit of a difference. It's become a big theme these days about the importance of getting people outside Whitehall. About 2/3 of the staff of the Department of Education are outside Whitehall, are in Darlington, Coventry, Bristol, Cambridge, Manchester, Sheffield, and so on. That's an important part of this. But cultural change does take time. I mean, it really does. Getting people to see how important it is to spend more time in schools, colleges. This is, we started the journey, but it's, it just generally does take time. I was struck by the fact that people would say to me, this is all very well what you're trying to do with us in the DfE, put the public at the heart of the work, but is that what your colleagues think as well? Will that help me get a promotion elsewhere? Actually, I thought that lots of senior civil servants in lots of different departments wanted to do this thing, but it requires a really concerted effort over a really long period of time. Of course, Gus is right to say that ministers are an important part of this. The only reason I focused here on the role of the civil service is not because ministers aren't important. In the end, they're in charge, and that's a jolly good thing. It's a democracy. But I don't want us to use, and I know that you don't want us either, Gus, to use ministers as an excuse for inaction. What's the best we can do in the situation we find ourselves in is the challenge that I was always trying to lay down for myself. Just give you one example though of how this is difficult stuff. I would always ask when I was preparing for a meeting at select committee for the civil servants I was working with to put themselves in the mind of the parliamentarian who was going to be asking me a question, put themselves in that mindset. But years of experience had told these civil servants the way to get ahead was to come up with a defensive line to take, something that sounded okay, but wasn't really getting to the heart of it, because getting to the heart of it would be embarrassing. So this stuff takes time, but I think we can make, and we do make progress on this stuff if we work together.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. So after asking for people to get in early with questions, they've really taken me at my word, and I've had more questions on this session than I've had in any of these before. So a very engaged audience. I'm going to try and group them into themes that kind of do reflect some of the things we've already touched on, but it's good to just air it from people's direct questions. So there's a lot of focus on the barriers, I guess, and how this doesn't come about. So there's a couple of questions with the related theme of why was Jonathan and others unable to make these changes when he was permanent secretary and head of policy profession. The analysis seems right, but can insiders actually change things? And that's from Robin Polding. And then looking at this practically, what would you have done differently in your time in the civil service in light of the conclusions you've drawn? And I think maybe that's for everyone reflecting back on that. But let's start with Jonathan and then come to the panel for any other reflections.
So clearly it is hard, absolutely, for insiders to make sufficient change on their own. And that's why part of what I'm proposing today is to open up the policy making process much more to external accountability. I don't think it's sufficient to ask us to make the changes ourselves. I don't. But I don't think that's an excuse for us not to do the best we can. You know, when Gus was the cabinet secretary, he looked around the top table and he saw that the permanent secretaries were essentially all male, almost all male. And he thought that wasn't good enough. And he set an objective of getting 50-50 male, female. That's what the population is. Why wouldn't that be the case at the top of the civil service? And he achieved it, right? That shows what the civil service can do when it takes action. This stuff is hard, but over time it can improve. I do think myself that the Department for Education is a more delivery-focused organisation than it was a few years ago. And I've given some examples, so has Justine herself. You know, you don't get to build a school over the summer holidays in the most difficult circumstances without having really good delivery skills. So I was trying, other people are trying, with a sort of combined effort right across the system in which we are supporting each other on this change, as well as with external challenge and scrutiny, then serious change really is possible.
Great. Justine, any thoughts on that?
I think just on reform, I think probably the most crucial reform, and I've said this before, is in Treasury. And I feel that the Levelling Up white paper is a very good example of where there are two strategies. You know, you had the finance strategy come out last October in the name of the spending review, and a rather dense but important document for departments, which was the spending review outcome metrics that Treasury will use. And then back to front, you then last month get the Levelling Up white paper, which actually fundamentally is the core strategy of this government alongside net zero. That, of course, identifies, I think, 24 headline measures from the ONS that this government will use to measure progress on its core strategy of levelling up, crucially important. But of those 24 measures, only 12 are in the Treasury departmental spending review outcome. So in other words, the government has two sets of KPIs. No organisation is going to be successful if you have two distinct sets of KPIs. And so these are really basic points, but they go to the heart of, if you like, a machine that will find it hard to perform at its best if departments are pulled in different directions on what they're being measured on in terms of the Levelling Up white paper, which is crucially important to this government and to the Prime Minister personally, and then how Treasury are checking on whether the money's been spent effectively. Those are the key things, I think, that really do need to be got to grips with. And Anthony Selden's asked a couple of points on short-term thinking. Of course, in a sense, this is what I mean when I say I think sometimes civil servants get pushed into and pulled into that more political environment. But, you know, until you end up with a set of public finances that have longer term modelling, for example, out to 2030, then who knows whether the plans are there to deliver the levelling up missions that the government has set itself. And until you model further out to 2030, maybe beyond, you're not really going to see whether investment in early years, for example, has any prospect of improving outcomes at school. And I think fundamentally it is this Treasury reform that is now absolutely vital. We are in a time in a world, the 21st century, where it is all about knowledge and talent. And the difference between the countries that succeed and that fail will be the ones that are able to develop and unlock the knowledge and talent of their people. It's as simple as that. But actually for Treasury, investment in human capital fundamentally is classed as a cost, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's spend on kids in pupil referral units. And whilst ever you see it as a cost, you will want to minimize it. That is a really basic principle that needs to change. Until we see investing, until Treasury sees investing in human capital and people as an investment, which is what it is, then it won't really end up taking functioning decisions about whether it's universities or anything else. And so you end up with policies potentially coming out of minimum entry requirements for universities. We know that young people in pupil referral units have something like a 6% chance of getting a GCSE in maths and English. They have lots of potential, but they're not in education settings that allow them to particularly achieve. Yet at the moment, we would say it's better to potentially now stop them going to university, even if it's a university that can help them succeed and get a degree. That's a bad waste of money. And the better alternative is apparently to allow them to continue down that high probability track of heading into the justice system, which is way more expensive. So these are the things for me that mean that all of this reform fundamentally, I think, does come back to Treasury, which is full of wonderfully talented people who I used to work with and have a huge amount of respect for. I just feel like they are trapped in a gilded cage that they themselves need to have the confidence to be able to reform their way out of, because no one else in government really, apart from the Prime Minister, can probably make them do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Justine. I'm going to come to you on this sort of theme, Gus, just to give a bit of context on what Anthony Selden's questions were. Is Whitehall adequately utilising institutional memory and history when making fresh policy? And should longer term thinking be more entrenched in Whitehall? Should the CPRS be re-established at the centre, was Anthony's points. But Gus, do you want to come back on any of those themes?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of points that are very easy to agree with. I mean, obviously the need for diversity, massively important. I made some progress on gender. I think during my time there were more specialists, to become Jonathan's point. If you looked at the Treasury, it was full of, I was going to say gifted amateurs and sometimes not so gifted. But, you know, we do now have serious professionals in there doing proper jobs. And, you know, there are two departments, I would say, that are really dominated by sort of professional expertise. And they are, as Justine said, DFID, where a lot of people go in there because they're really, really interested in development issues. And Treasury, where they're really, really interested in managing the economy. And that has its strengths and its weaknesses. And you'll find that, you know, trying to persuade people in DFID to go and work somewhere else is quite hard. They're not really that interested. So there are some issues there. But I certainly think we need to make more progress on diversity. We've done it on gender. We've now got better data on social mobility, as Justine was saying, but we need to start using that, and we need to work on the ethnicity part, which is lagging behind. So no question, a lot more to be done there. On the question of levelling up and the Treasury, which Justine raised, I'm a big fan of the levelling up white paper. And I think what needs to happen now, and I kind of own up that I spoke to Andy Haldane about this quite a lot, it needs to be turned into a reality, right? All those missions that are there need to be, as Justine said, they need to be what the government is trying to achieve and what the Treasury has as its plan to achieve, you know, including things like well-being, very close to my own heart. And let's stop this nonsense about GDP. You know, let's think about proper measures of success for the economy and for society. And we can do that. And I think the Treasury will be very flexible. And like I say, they are actually moving down that path. But they need guidance from above. You know, these needs to be specified. You're absolutely right. The Chancellor needs to start making some speeches about this stuff. So I look forward to hearing him say he's completely committed to the levelling up agenda, and here's what he's going to do about it. Because at the moment, the rhetoric is very good, but the reality is completely opposite. If you look at, and this is research that Pro Bono Economics has done, if you look at what the government spent its money on levelling up, it's all physical capital. It's like 90%, it's roads and stuff like that. That's the plan, right? Whereas Justine said, she said, we need to invest in human capital. I would add social capital. If you're going to look at communities and all the rest of it, you need those two things, which don't cost you a lot, but are massively underinvested in relative to the plans, which are more concrete, basically, and I don't think are going to work. So we do have long-term plans, 25-year environment plan I was talking about last night, net zero. These are long-term issues. So we do need a long-term mindset. And hopefully we can apply, all the stuff we're doing in climate change, with the climate change committee and interim targets and a separate committee to say whether the government's on track or not, to things like, are we on track to deliver what we want on the levelling up agenda? At the moment, there's some good aspirations, but lots more needs to be done. And I think that would galvanise the civil service, give it a long-term objective, which hopefully we could get cross-party support for, and that would enable us to do the right things, and then build up our expertise in those longer-term subjects like biodiversity and the like, which at the moment we have to get outsiders in to help us with.
Thanks very much, Gus. So, I mean, I just picking up on that theme about place, really, because that has come through strongly in the questions. I just try and put together a couple about place and local government and throw those back to you to see what you want to pick up. So from Liam Askins, it's a comment around, as well as building up specialisms of subject matter, do you agree there is also a need to build up better understanding of places and how different policies come together in those places? How do we promote better opportunities for non-London based civil servants, in particular, from Liam? And then from Paul Whiteley, a view that local government has been systematically undermined for the past 50 years on the grounds that Whitehall knows best. Why do speakers think that's happened when they're much closer to the ground when it comes to understanding delivery? And obviously how that fits now with this more local, more place-based focus that we have now with levelling up. Jonathan, any themes to pick up from that from you first?
Thanks very much. So one of the things that Justine asked me to do when I was working for her was to put in place, she's referred them already, opportunity areas. We look at a number of parts of the country where children were struggling most at school. Blackpool was one, Hastings, a number of Scarborough, and established very small teams of civil servants in each of those communities who would work with parents, with pupils, with teachers, with businesses to see what could be done to help make progress. And it was a small scale thing because we wanted to try it out first before we sought to expand it. And I was pleased to see it referenced by Martin Gove in his Levelling Up white paper the other day as an opportunity to grow further. The reason I mention it is because of the difference that being a member of one of those opportunity area teams made to people in the Department of Education. It was transformational. Because if you're a member of the DfE working in Blackpool, spending your day with teachers and parents grappling with the question about why so many kids get excluded from one school in Blackpool and get then picked up by another and then get excluded a second time, you really start to grapple with the issue in a way that it's just too hard if you're stuck in Whitehall. Of course, they were civil servants, so they worked for Justine, and their advice on policy changes went to her, but they were informed by the reality of what was going on the ground, and they absolutely loved it. And that was one small example of what one could do at much bigger scale, particularly if civil servants saw themselves much more as part of the public service as a whole, in a way, as is referenced in my paper today, as they do in Germany, where the distinction between civil servants and the wider public service is much less drawn. Or in Singapore, where you don't get to be a permanent secretary, you simply don't, unless you spent 3 years minimum in charge of delivering something operational on the ground. Whereas, as you know, and some of the questioners have described, the way the civil service works culturally is to think of itself as sort of better in Whitehall than anybody else. When I arrived from local government, I felt like I was second class. And luckily, I was white, I was male, I'd been to Ross University, I was reasonably bright. My dad taught me how to debate, so I managed to succeed in that system despite the way the civil service works. And so diversity is absolutely key to this, for civil servants to think of themselves as part of the community rather than separate from it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Justine, any reflections on that?
It's great to hear what Jonathan was saying about opportunity areas. They were, for me, my hypothesis was that results in schools are partly down to what's happening in schools, but they're also a lot down to what's happening outside of schools. Ergo, if you want to improve results in schools, you have to have a plan that is able to tackle both those things, not just half of it. And so for me, that was about a system fix for a systemic problem. And that's what opportunity areas were fundamentally about. But like Jonathan said, I was fascinated by the response within the department, the fact that I had emails coming into my private office saying, oh, I grew up in Norwich. I'd really be happy to volunteer for the opportunity area there or to get more involved. And I think it really did tap into people's instinct of achieving things on the ground. I think the final thing that I would say, and I think where this ties in with local government is, levelling up is about a system fix. And I remember talking to my officials about reading Peter Senge's book on systems, because actually seeing and having a clearer understanding as officials about how things relate to one another and having very clear senses in your head architecturally around the policy crossovers, I think is probably one of the keys to officials being able to develop smarter policy. I'll finish off by saying there are always the turf wars that were experienced when I was in Whitehall. And I remember with opportunity areas, I thought about maybe trying to join up, of course, with the DWP, maybe with Treasury on economics or Bays. I decided I would never get them off the ground if I tried to knit it all together. Of course, what happened was we got them going as a DFE, they all connected up with one another on the ground. So you end up with fantastic innovation like Glasses for Classes in Bradford, where the local opportunity area team, of course, worked with the local NHS. And so I think that's partly why the devolution agenda matters, because it can allow some of those partnerships to just quite organically form. But unless there's the clear mission that's driving those teams, then I don't think you get as far. But I'll leave you with the African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We'll go far on levelling up by going together, but that means Whitehall finding the ways to work in partnership with itself as well as with local government.
Excellent, thank you, Justine. Gus, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would very strongly agree with that, because I think the most difficult parts anywhere are where you're working cross-departmentally and also cross levels between central, local government and the like. And to be honest, central government could decide to devolve a lot more to local authorities if they wanted to, and they don't in general. That's the bottom line politically. They could, but they don't. And when Andy came to look at that levelling up white paper, he was basically told there isn't any money. So he looked at system fixes, and I think actually that may turn out to be a very good thing. That actually what we need to think about is to what extent can we devolve genuine power and accountability and responsibility to more local levels. And I think that could be crucial, but it would require a very serious analysis about why is it that we do so much stuff at the central level. Why is the UK over the many years one of the most centralized economies and centralized governments that we've ever had, and we do have this issue of being highly centralized in terms of economic weight as well towards the southeast. So I think there's some fundamental issues we need to analyze more carefully and then sort out how best to deliver what people want, and to tackle the issue about, you always get these things thrown back at you about postcode bloody lotteries, like it's not the same here as it is there. Well, actually, if we're going to devolve, we're going to do things differently at different levels, we are going to have variations across the country in the way things are delivered, and the results that inevitably different level of results around the country. We've got to kind of get to be grown up about handling that.
Great, thank you, Gus. I just want to give the final word on a final question to Jonathan, since we're just on time now, and it reflects that a lot of this is systemic, as Justine has outlined really, really well. But given our audience here, there's going to be lots of officials within the audience. And one question from Rich Hayward that was submitted in advance is maybe just your final reflections, Jonathan, on what practically should an average official do in this context? Is there things that they can be doing? Spending time on sectoral visits and talking to representative bodies, not entirely uncommon, but is that enough? And is there more that they can do?
Nice to hear from you, Rich. Several years since we worked together. Great question. So it's hard if you are a typical grade 7, ambitious to achieve your potential, because you look around and you see, as I said earlier, you know, what gets rewarded is people who move on quickly. But in the long run, you will definitely benefit from really understanding your subject matter, and you'll get much better reward from so doing. And in ways that you've already heard from us in the last hour or so, it is possible to do that by joining the right team. I gave an example of an opportunity area team, but there are many other examples that I could have given. You know, remember why you joined the civil service, which I know you do. It was to make a difference. Stay in the area of work you're doing in order to achieve a difference. Learn from that experience, and you will be so much more valuable in what you take on next. Try some time outside the civil service. Don't spend all of your career in it. Spend some time in business or in local government, somewhere else. You will come back so much better at your job. It will be so much rewarding, more rewarding. You're much less likely to be critical of local government if you spend some time in it on the receiving end of central government than otherwise. Stay true to why you joined. That's the message from me. Remember that it was to make a difference, and test yourself every week. Am I making a difference? If not, what can I do differently? You know, easier said than done, but that's the challenge for all of us. And if we work that way, goodness me, we can make things better.
Brilliant. What a great way to end. I'm sorry, I've let us overrun by 2 or 3 minutes, but worth it just to get that reflection from Jonathan at the end there. So that's it from us for this session. Just left for me to thank everyone for coming and staying with us today, and the brilliant questions. Sorry, I couldn't get through more of them. To thank the team at the Policy Institute for putting this together, and the report and release. To, of course, our absolutely brilliant panel of Justine and Gus, and of course Jonathan for his excellent report and discussion today. Thank you all.